My principal refused to investigate the teacher everyone knew was inappropriate, even threatened to suspend students who complained while more girls came forward every week. When I reported him with evidence, she said, "Ruin his career, and I'll ruin yours." I stayed silent for months. That was 1 year ago. Monday, she was arrested at a school board meeting. Principal Lydia Brennan was mid-sentence about the district's new anti-bullying initiative when Detective Frank Doyle walked down the center aisle of the packed auditorium with 2 uniformed officers flanking him. I watched from my seat in the back row as her face went from confident to confused to absolutely terrified in about 3 seconds. The detective held up his badge and said something I couldn't hear over the sudden murmur of 300 confused parents and teachers. Principal Brennan stepped back from the podium, shaking her head, saying no repeatedly while gesturing at the crowd like they could somehow protect her from what was happening. One of the officers moved behind her, and I saw the silver flash of handcuffs. That's when she looked directly at me across the entire auditorium, her eyes finding mine like she'd known exactly where I was sitting the whole time. The expression on her face wasn't shock or denial anymore. It was pure rage mixed with something that looked almost like recognition, like she was thinking, "I told you I'd ruin you if you did this." Then the officer was guiding her hands behind her back and reading her rights, while camera phones came out everywhere and the school board president was trying to restore order that would never actually return. I'd been a student at Westfield High for exactly 3 years and 4 months when I first noticed something wrong with Mr. Vaughn's behavior around female students. It started small, the kind of thing you notice but immediately rationalize away, because teachers are supposed to be safe and trustworthy, and accusing one of anything serious feels impossible. I was a junior taking his AP English class, sitting in the 3rd row next to my friend Olivia Chen, who was one of the smartest people I knew and had dreams of studying journalism at Columbia. Mr. Scott Vaughn was young for a teacher, maybe 32, and he had that charismatic energy that made his classes actually engaging instead of the usual monotone lecture format. He'd reference current movies and music, make jokes that actually landed, and genuinely seemed to care about literature in a way that made you care too. Students loved his class, and I'd felt lucky to get into his AP section after hearing upperclassmen rave about how he prepared them for college-level writing. Parents loved him at conferences, the administration featured him in recruitment materials, and he'd won Teacher of the Year twice in his 6 years at Westfield. The first weird moment happened during a one-on-one conference about my essay on The Great Gatsby. Mr. Vaughn had asked me to stay after class to discuss my thesis, which was normal since he did that with lots of students. But when Olivia stayed too because we always walked to lunch together, he specifically asked her to wait outside because he needed to talk to me privately. She left, and he closed the classroom door completely, which felt odd, but not alarming yet. Then he spent 15 minutes giving me actually helpful feedback about my argument structure and use of textual evidence. Everything seemed professional until I stood up to leave and noticed he'd moved closer than necessary, close enough that I had to step back to maintain normal personal space. He smiled and touched my shoulder briefly while saying I had real potential as a writer, and something about the touch felt wrong even though it lasted maybe 2 seconds. I told myself I was being paranoid, that teachers touched students' shoulders all the time in encouraging gestures, that I was reading too much into a normal interaction. But then I started noticing the pattern. Mr. Vaughn called female students to his desk constantly during class, having them bend over to look at comments on their papers, while he sat in his chair at an angle that seemed designed to look down their shirts. He'd find reasons to brush past girls in the narrow aisles between desks when there was plenty of room to walk without contact. During the school play rehearsals, he advised, he'd put his hands on actresses' shoulders or backs while giving direction, letting his hands linger just slightly too long. The conversations he had with certain girls during lunch duty in the cafeteria involved him standing too close, leaning in to hear them over the noise in a way that invaded their personal space. I watched this happen day after day, and each time I noticed something I'd tell myself it could be innocent, that maybe I was looking for problems that weren't there, that surely other people would say something if anything was actually wrong. But the knot in my stomach got tighter every time I saw him single out another girl, and the excuses I made to myself started sounding weaker. The situation escalated noticeably in early October when Mr. Vaughn started asking students to stay after school for extra help sessions. Nothing unusual about that except he only offered these sessions to girls, specifically girls who dressed in ways he apparently found appealing, and the sessions were always one-on-one in his classroom with the door closed. Olivia mentioned he'd asked her to come in on a Thursday after school to discuss her college essay, even though that wasn't part of his class responsibilities, and she hadn't asked for help. She felt weird about it and asked if I'd wait in the hallway, so I did, sitting on the floor by the lockers pretending to study while actually timing how long she was in there. 38 minutes. When she came out, her face was flushed, and she wouldn't quite look at me. I asked if everything was okay, and she said yes too quickly, then changed the subject to weekend plans. I didn't push because I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to ask if something had happened without sounding like I was accusing her of lying or making something up. 2 weeks later, a sophomore named Chloe Winters broke down crying in the bathroom during lunch, and I only knew because her friend Ava came running into the cafeteria looking for a teacher. I heard them talking in urgent whispers about Mr. Vaughn and something he'd said during a makeup test session. The details were unclear, but the distress was obvious. Chloe ended up going home sick, and when she came back the next day, she was quiet and jumpy in a way she hadn't been before. I noticed Mr. Vaughn watching her during class with this expression that made my skin crawl. Not quite smiling, but something close to it, like he enjoyed seeing her uncomfortable. That was the moment I realized this wasn't paranoia or misinterpreted social cues. Something was very wrong, and it was getting worse. I tried talking to my friend Marcus about what I'd been noticing, choosing my words carefully because accusing a popular teacher of inappropriate behavior felt like stepping into a minefield. Marcus listened while we sat in his car before basketball practice, and when I finished explaining the patterns I'd observed, he got quiet for a long time. Then he told me his girlfriend Jessica had mentioned Mr. Vaughn, making her uncomfortable during her conference about a poetry assignment, asking personal questions about her relationship with Marcus and whether she felt fulfilled, which had nothing to do with her actual poem. Marcus said he'd wanted to say something, but Jessica begged him not to because she didn't want to cause drama or get labeled as someone who made false accusations. The fact that she'd framed it as potentially false accusations before even reporting anything true showed how deeply the fear of not being believed was embedded. We sat there realizing we both knew something was wrong, but neither of us knew what to do about it, without proof, without multiple witnesses, without something concrete that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The breaking point came on a Friday in late October during our regular class period. Mr. Vaughn had assigned group work analyzing different chapters of the Scarlet Letter, and I was working with Olivia and two other students near the back of the classroom. Mr. Vaughn was moving between groups, ostensibly checking our progress, but I noticed he spent significantly more time with the all-female groups, pulling up a chair and sitting unnecessarily close. When he got to a group of 3 junior girls in the front row, I watched him put his hand on the back of one girl's chair in a way that meant his arm was basically around her. She shifted forward, away from the contact, and he moved with her, maintaining the positioning. My stomach turned watching this happen in full view of 26 other students, this casual violation of personal space that he clearly didn't think anyone would challenge. Then Mr. Vaughn called Olivia up to his desk to discuss her group's analysis, and something about the way he said it, the specific tone, made me pay closer attention. She walked to the front, and he gestured for her to come around to his side of the desk instead of standing in front of it like students normally did. I couldn't hear what they were saying over the classroom noise, but I could see his body language, the way he was angled toward her, how he kept touching the papers on his desk, and then gesturing in ways that made her lean closer. At one point, his hand moved to her lower back, and I saw Olivia freeze completely for just a second before carefully stepping to the side. Mr. Vaughn smiled like nothing had happened and sent her back to our group. When she sat down, her hands were shaking slightly as she picked up her pen. I asked if she was okay, and she gave me that same 2 quick yes she'd given before, but this time, I also saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. That afternoon, I decided I had to do something even if I didn't know exactly what. I started documenting everything I could remember, writing down dates and times and specific incidents I'd witnessed over the past months. The list grew to 3 pages in my notebook, each entry more disturbing than the last when seen as a pattern rather than isolated moments. I texted Marcus asking if Jessica would be willing to talk to someone official about her experience, and he said he'd ask, but wasn't optimistic. Then I made what I thought was the logical next step and sent an email to Principal Brennan requesting a private meeting to discuss a serious concern. She responded within 2 hours, saying she had an opening Monday morning before school at 7:15 a.m. I spent the entire weekend rehearsing what I'd say, trying to find the right words to explain what I'd seen without sounding like a kid with a grudge or an overactive imagination. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of November weather that matched my anxiety about this meeting. I got to school at 7:10 a.m. and waited in the main office until Principal Brennan's secretary waved me into the principal's office. Lydia Brennan was in her mid-50s, with steel gray hair cut in a severe bob and glasses that she used as a prop, taking them off for emphasis during important statements. She'd been principal at Westfield for 9 years and had a reputation for being strict but fair, someone who cared about academic achievement and college admission statistics. I'd never had a personal interaction with her before, and sitting across from her massive desk with its perfectly organized files and family photos, I felt very young and very unsure. She asked what was so urgent that I needed to meet before school hours, and I took a breath and started explaining what I'd observed about Mr. Vaughn's behavior. I made it through maybe 3 examples before Principal Brennan held up her hand to stop me. Her expression had shifted from professional interest to something harder, more closed off. She asked if I had any actual evidence of wrongdoing or if this was just my interpretation of normal teacher-student interactions. I said I'd written down specific incidents with dates and times, and she asked if I'd witnessed any explicit inappropriate contact. I described the hand on the back, the unnecessarily close conversations, the patterns of behavior that created an uncomfortable environment. Principal Brennan's mouth pressed into a thin line, and she told me that Mr. Vaughn was one of the most respected teachers at Westfield, that he'd won multiple awards and had glowing reviews from students and parents, and that vague feelings of discomfort were not grounds for an investigation that could destroy a good man's career. I tried to explain that this wasn't vague, that multiple students had expressed concerns, that there was a clear pattern. Principal Brennan cut me off again and asked who these multiple students were. When I hesitated, not wanting to name Olivia or Jessica without their explicit permission, she pounced on that hesitation, She said, if there were really other students with legitimate concerns, they would come forward themselves. The fact that I was here alone making accusations based on my personal observations suggested this was more about my perception than any actual misconduct. Then her tone shifted from dismissive to threatening. She leaned forward and said that making false allegations against a teacher was a serious matter that could result in disciplinary action for me. She said if I continued spreading rumors about Mr. Vaughn, she would have to consider whether I was creating a hostile environment and whether suspension might be necessary to protect the school community. The words hit me like ice water. I'd come to her for help, and she was threatening to suspend me for reporting a problem. I left her office shaking and went straight to the bathroom where I locked myself in a stall and tried to breathe normally. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes and accomplished nothing except making me a target. I pulled out my phone and texted Marcus what had happened, and he responded immediately saying that was insane and illegal. But knowing something was wrong didn't give me any clearer path forward. I'd gone to the principal, the person supposedly responsible for student safety, and been threatened into silence. The rest of that day passed in a blur of classes where I couldn't focus, watching Mr. Vaughn teach with his usual charisma while knowing exactly what he was doing and feeling completely powerless to stop it. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more girls approached me quietly because word had spread that I'd tried to report Mr. Vaughn. Each of them had their own story. A senior named Kayla described him touching her hair during a conference and commenting on how soft it was. A junior named Isabel talked about him asking inappropriate questions about her dating life and whether her boyfriend satisfied her emotionally. A freshman named Mara, who looked terrified even having this conversation, whispered about him standing behind her during a test and putting his hands on her shoulders while reading her essay over her shoulder, his breath on her neck making her freeze up completely. They all said the same thing at the end of their stories. They couldn't report it because they didn't think anyone would believe them, or they were afraid of retaliation, or they didn't want to be known as the girl who accused Mr. Vaughn. The fear was universal and entirely justified given Principal Brennan's response to my attempt. I started carrying my phone everywhere and taking videos whenever I saw Mr. Vaughn interact with students in the hallways or cafeteria. Most of it looked innocent on camera because he was good at making everything seem casual and appropriate to anyone who wasn't watching closely. But I caught one video on November 18th that was undeniable. Mr. Vaughn was in the hallway during passing period, and I saw him deliberately position himself near the junior lockers where girls were getting books for their next class. In the video, you can see him watching, waiting, and then timing his walk to coincide with a girl closing her locker. He brushed past her in a hallway that had plenty of space, his hand grazing her hip as he passed, and you can see her flinch and pull away. It happened in 3 seconds, but the intention was clear. I had evidence now, actual documentation that couldn't be explained away as misinterpretation. I requested another meeting with Principal Brennan, this time via official email so there would be a record. She made me wait 4 days before agreeing to meet on a Monday afternoon after school. I brought my phone with the video queued up and my notebook with the expanded list of incidents and the names of girls who'd reported concerns to me. I also brought Marcus as a witness, though Principal Brennan tried to exclude him until I said I wanted someone else present for my own comfort. She allowed him to stay but made him sit in the corner, and then she turned to me with an expression of barely contained irritation. Before I could even start, she asked if this was really about Mr. Vaughn, or if I had some personal issue with him, perhaps a grade I felt was unfair. I said this had nothing to do with grades and everything to do with protecting students from a teacher who was violating boundaries. I showed her the video. She watched it once, expression neutral, and then asked to see it again. I played it twice more, each time pointing out the unnecessary contact and the girl's obvious discomfort. Principal Brennan handed my phone back and said what I'd shown her was a crowded hallway during passing period where incidental contact was inevitable. She said the video proved nothing except normal movement through a busy space. I started to argue, but she held up her hand and her voice went cold. She said she'd warned me about making accusations against Mr. Vaughn, and here I was again with what she called manufactured evidence that proved nothing. Then she looked at Marcus and asked if he understood that bearing false witness to support a friend could also result in disciplinary consequences. Marcus nodded but didn't say anything, and I could see he was shaken by the implicit threat. Principal Brennan stood up, signaling the meeting was over, and delivered the line that would haunt me for months. She said, "Let me be very clear. If you continue this campaign against Mr. Vaughn, if you try to ruin his career and reputation with these baseless accusations, I will personally ensure that your academic future is destroyed. I will make sure every college you apply to knows you're a student who makes false allegations and creates hostile environments. I will ruin yours before you can ruin his. Do we understand each other?" The threat was explicit and specific and terrifying. I was a senior with early applications already submitted to 6 schools. My entire future depended on my academic record and recommendations, and she was threatening to sabotage all of it. I nodded silently because I didn't know what else to do, and Marcus and I left her office without saying another word. For 3 months, I stayed silent. I deleted the video from my phone because having it felt dangerous. I stopped documenting incidents even though they continued happening all around me. When girls approached me with new stories about Mr. Vaughn, I listened, but told them I couldn't help, that I'd tried and failed and risked too much already. The guilt ate at me every single day, knowing I was protecting my own future while other students continued to be victimized. Marcus tried to convince me to go above Principal Brennan's head, maybe to the school board or the district superintendent, but I was paralyzed by fear of her threats. Every time I thought about speaking up, I imagined my college acceptances being rescinded, my recommendations being withdrawn, my entire future evaporating because one vindictive principal decided to make good on her promise. The winter break came and went, and I returned for spring semester feeling hollowed out and ashamed. Then, in late January, something changed. A senior named Allison Tracy went to the school nurse after a breakdown in the bathroom, and the nurse, Mrs. Patricia Valdez, who'd been at Westfield for 23 years, saw something that triggered her mandatory reporting instincts. Allison told the nurse that Mr. Vaughn had called her in for an after-school session about her final project and had touched her thigh while they were reviewing her outline. Mrs. Valdez immediately contacted Child Protective Services as required by law, and CPS investigator Linda Morrison showed up at school the next day to interview Allison. The interview expanded when Allison mentioned that other girls had complained about Mr. Vaughn, and suddenly CPS wanted to talk to multiple students. I got called out of calculus on a Thursday morning and brought to a conference room where Linda Morrison was waiting with another CPS worker named James York. They introduced themselves, explained they were investigating allegations of inappropriate conduct by a staff member, and asked if I'd be willing to answer some questions. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Finally, someone with actual authority was taking this seriously. I told them everything. Every incident I'd witnessed, every girl who'd confided in me, the videos I'd taken before deleting them, my 2 meetings with Principal Brennan, and her explicit threats. Linda took notes on a laptop while James recorded the conversation with my permission. When I described Principal Brennan's threat to ruin my academic future, Linda's expression hardened, and she asked me to repeat the exact words. I did, and she wrote them down verbatim. Over the next week, CPS interviewed 23 students total. Olivia finally told her story about the after-school conference where Mr. Vaughn had asked her inappropriate questions about her body and whether she'd ever considered modeling. Jessica described the personal questions about her relationship. Kayla, Isabel, Mara, and 18 other girls came forward with their own accounts of boundary violations, inappropriate comments, and unwanted physical contact. The pattern was undeniable when all the stories were compiled together, a 6-year history of predatory behavior that had been allowed to continue because students were too afraid to report and administration refused to investigate. CPS submitted their findings to the district on February 8th, recommending immediate removal of Mr. Vaughn pending a full investigation and also noting concerns about Principal Brennan's handling of previous complaints. Mr. Vaughn was placed on administrative leave the following Monday. The school sent out a vague email about a personnel matter being investigated, and rumors exploded through the hallways. Some students were supportive, thanking those of us who'd come forward. Others were hostile, accusing us of destroying a good teacher's career over nothing. Mr. Vaughn's wife started a Facebook group called Stand with Scott Vaughn that gained 300 members in 2 days, mostly parents who couldn't believe their children's favorite teacher was capable of misconduct. The backlash was intense and personal, with anonymous accounts harassing those of us who'd reported on social media, calling us liars and attention seekers. I had to make all my accounts private after someone posted my phone number, and I started getting threatening texts. Principal Brennan called an emergency assembly to address the situation, and her message was carefully crafted to minimize what was happening. She talked about false allegations and due process and the importance of not rushing to judgment. She never mentioned that CPS had found credible evidence or that multiple students had reported similar experiences. Instead, she framed it as 1 or 2 students making questionable claims that were being taken too seriously by outside agencies. The assembly felt like a continuation of her cover-up, and I watched from the bleachers feeling sick that she was still in charge, still controlling the narrative, still protecting Mr. Vaughn even after everything had come out. But CPS wasn't the only agency involved anymore. Detective Frank Doyle from the County Special Victims Unit contacted me on February 20th, asking if I'd be willing to give a formal statement about what I'd witnessed and reported. Detective Doyle was in his late 40s, with 22 years of experience in sex crimes investigations, and he took this case very seriously. I met him at the police station with my parents present, and he recorded my statement, while another detective named Carol Russell took detailed notes. I told them everything again, including Principal Brennan's threats, and Detective Doyle asked if I'd testify to that if necessary. I said yes, absolutely. He explained that they were building a criminal case against Mr. Vaughn for multiple counts of sexual misconduct with minors, and that Principal Brennan was also being investigated for obstruction and failure to report suspected abuse as mandated by her position. The criminal investigation took months. Detective Doyle interviewed every student who'd filed a CPS report, collected documentation of complaints that had been dismissed or buried, and subpoenaed Principal Brennan's emails and files. What they found was worse than anyone expected. Principal Brennan had received written complaints about Mr. Vaughn from 4 different parents over the past 3 years, and she'd responded to each one by defending Mr. Vaughn and suggesting the students were misinterpreting friendly behavior. She'd never forwarded the complaints to HR or the district office as required by policy. She'd actively suppressed multiple reports of concerning behavior, creating a paper trail of willful negligence. One email from 2 years ago showed a parent explicitly stating their daughter was afraid of Mr. Vaughn after he'd cornered her in an empty classroom. and Principal Brennan's response was that the parents should teach their daughter not to make serious accusations without proof. On May 3rd, Mr. Vaughn was arrested at his home and charged with 11 counts of sexual misconduct with students, charges spanning his entire tenure at Westfield. The arrest made the local news, and suddenly our small story became a media circus. Reporters camped outside the school asking for interviews, and the district hired a crisis management firm to handle the publicity. Mr. Vaughn's wife shut down her Facebook group after evidence of his text messages with students was leaked, showing a pattern of grooming behavior that couldn't be explained away as misunderstanding. The texts included him asking girls about their personal lives, complimenting their appearance in ways that were clearly inappropriate, and requesting photos. Several students had saved the messages after feeling uncomfortable, and those screenshots became Exhibits A through F in the criminal case. The school board held an emergency meeting on May 10th to discuss the situation, and over 400 community members showed up. Parents demanded answers about how this had been allowed to happen. Students who'd been victimized spoke tearfully about the impact of being dismissed when they tried to report. I spoke for 8 minutes, describing my meetings with Principal Brennan and her explicit threats to ruin my future if I continued reporting. The board members looked genuinely shocked, and the superintendent, Dr. Gerald Thompson, promised a full investigation into administrative failures. Principal Brennan sat in the front row during this meeting, her face carefully neutral, occasionally shaking her head as if all the testimony was false or exaggerated. She didn't speak during the public comment period, which only made her look more guilty. 3 weeks later, the district's internal investigation concluded that Principal Brennan had violated multiple policies regarding mandatory reporting and had actively obstructed efforts to investigate credible allegations. She was placed on administrative leave pending termination proceedings. The school board voted unanimously to begin the process of revoking her administrative credential. But administrative leave and pending termination weren't criminal consequences, and many of us felt she was getting off too easy for enabling years of abuse. Detective Doyle kept investigating, though, building a separate case against her for obstruction of justice and failure to report child abuse. He told me the criminal charges would take time because they had to prove not just negligence, but willful intent to suppress information. Summer arrived and I graduated, accepting admission to Northwestern, where I planned to study journalism and maybe law. The day felt bittersweet, celebrating achievement while knowing so many people had been hurt because the system failed to protect them. At graduation, Principal Brennan's absence was noted, with the assistant principal handing out diplomas instead. Some parents clapped when her name wasn't mentioned during the opening remarks. Mr. Vaughn's criminal trial was scheduled for October, with multiple student victims prepared to testify. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Moore, felt confident about conviction based on the overwhelming evidence and witness testimony. She met with all of us who would be testifying and prepared us for what defense attorneys might ask, how they might try to discredit our accounts or suggest we'd coordinated our stories. I spent the summer working at a law firm as a paralegal intern, filing documents and learning about the legal system that had finally started working after months of failure. My boss, Attorney Jennifer Blake, who specialized in education law, was fascinated by the Westfield case and explained to me how rare it was for principals to face criminal charges for administrative failures. She said most cases like this resulted in civil settlements and job loss, but not actual arrest. The fact that Detective Doyle was pursuing criminal charges against Principal Brennan meant he'd found something beyond simple negligence, evidence of active cover-up that rose to the level of criminal conspiracy. That gave me hope that real accountability might actually happen. In early September, Detective Doyle called me with news that the district attorney was filing criminal charges against Principal Brennan. 4 counts of failure to report suspected child abuse, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of witness intimidation based on her threats to me and other students. The arrest warrant was issued on September 15th, but Detective Doyle decided to wait for the perfect moment to execute it, somewhere public where Principal Brennan couldn't claim victimhood or spin the narrative. He chose the monthly school board meeting scheduled for Monday, September 23rd, where Principal Brennan would be present to address her termination proceedings. The symbolism was deliberate, arresting her in front of the same community she'd failed to protect, in the same venue where students had testified about her obstruction. I attended that school board meeting with my parents, sitting in the back row of the auditorium, along with dozens of other former students who'd been involved in the case. Principal Brennan arrived in a navy suit looking confident, probably expecting to give some prepared statement about being unfairly scapegoated. The board president began the meeting by discussing budget items and facility updates, standard boring content that made the arrest even more dramatic by contrast. 20 minutes into the meeting, Principal Brennan was recognized to speak about her termination appeal. She stood at the podium and started reading from prepared remarks about her decades of service to education and her commitment to student success. That's when Detective Doyle walked through the auditorium doors with 2 uniformed officers behind him. The room went completely silent, except for Principal Brennan's voice, which faltered mid-sentence as she saw them approaching. Detective Doyle walked down the center aisle with his badge visible, and Principal Brennan's prepared speech dissolved into stammered confusion. She stepped back from the podium as he approached the stage, and I could see her hands shaking even from the back row. Detective Doyle identified himself clearly for the record and for the many phones now recording. He said Lydia Brennan was under arrest for failure to report child abuse, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. The uniformed officers moved to either side of her, and one began reading her Miranda rights, while the other produced handcuffs. Principal Brennan's face cycled through disbelief, fear, and then anger as she scanned the audience and locked eyes with me. For 3 full seconds, she stared at me with pure hatred, and I stared back without looking away. This was the ruin she'd promised me, except it was hers, not mine. The officers cuffed her wrists behind her back and began escorting her down from the stage. The school board president tried to restore order, but the auditorium erupted into chaos, people standing and talking and taking photos. News cameras that had been set up to cover the termination hearing captured every moment of the arrest. As Principal Brennan was led past my row, she turned her head to look at me one more time and said something I couldn't hear over the noise. My dad put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You did the right thing." I nodded, but didn't say anything because I was watching her being walked out of the auditorium in handcuffs, finally facing consequences for choosing to protect a predator instead of the students she was supposed to keep safe. The arrest dominated local news for 3 days. Every station ran footage of Principal Brennan being led out of the school board meeting in handcuffs. The comments on news articles were overwhelmingly supportive of the arrest, with only a few defenders claiming she was being unfairly targeted. Her bail was set at $50,000, and she posted it within 24 hours through a bail bondsman. The trial was scheduled for early December, and the prosecution made it clear they were seeking the maximum sentence of 8 years in prison. Mr. Vaughn's trial began first in late October, and I testified for 3 hours about what I'd witnessed and reported. The jury convicted him on 9 of 11 counts after 4 hours of deliberation, and he was sentenced to 18 years in state prison. Several of the girls who testified cried with relief when the verdict was read. Principal Brennan's trial began on December 9th and lasted 6 days. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her systematic failure to investigate or report multiple credible allegations. They showed the emails from concerned parents that she'd dismissed, the complaints from students that she'd buried, and my testimony about her explicit threats to destroy my academic future if I continued reporting Mr. Vaughn. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she'd used her professional judgment to determine the complaints weren't credible, but the prosecutor destroyed that argument by showing how she'd never actually investigated any of the claims. She'd simply chosen to believe Mr. Vaughn over multiple students reporting similar experiences. The jury convicted her on all 7 counts after 2 days of deliberation. At sentencing 3 weeks later, Judge Lawrence Keller noted that Principal Brennan had betrayed the fundamental trust placed in school administrators to protect children. He said her actions had enabled years of abuse and had traumatized students twice, once by the initial misconduct, and again when they were threatened for trying to report it. He sentenced her to 6 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Principal Brennan showed no emotion as the sentence was read, maintaining the same controlled expression she'd had throughout the trial. As marshals led her away to begin serving her sentence, I felt something release in my chest that had been tight since that first meeting in her office over a year ago. She'd threatened to ruin me. Instead, her own choices had ruined her. A year later, I'm a freshman at Northwestern studying journalism with a focus on investigative reporting. The Westfield case became the subject of my admissions essay, and apparently, it resonated with the selection committee. Olivia got into Columbia like she'd always dreamed and is studying journalism too. We talk every few weeks about maybe collaborating on a long-form piece about institutional failure in schools and how systems protect abusers. Marcus is at State University playing basketball and dating Jessica still. Most of the girls who testified have moved on to college or new schools, carrying scars, but also the knowledge that they were believed, that they were protected eventually, even if it took too long. Mr. Vaughn is serving his sentence at Ironwood Correctional Facility, and Principal Brennan is at the women's prison 2 hours north. Neither will be eligible for parole for at least 4 years. I still think about that moment in Principal Brennan's office when she threatened to ruin my future if I kept reporting what I'd seen, how she weaponized her authority to silence a student trying to protect others, how she chose institutional reputation and personal convenience over the safety of children she was entrusted to serve. The system failed us for a long time because people in power decided protecting an abuser was easier than doing the right thing. But eventually, the truth came out anyway. It always does. The people who tried to bury it just ended up buried by it instead. She said she'd ruin me. She was wrong. I just had to be patient enough to let her ruin herself. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.